let's just jump into transitioning into my main presentation, which is going to be about how can you position yourself to transition to a product role. Already did that. So a little bit about myself. I currently am a product manager at WeWork, but prior to that, I actually worked at Amazon in Seattle as a program/product manager. Before that, I actually worked at this company in Chicago called Innova International, where I did multiple roles. So I worked in business operations, then I worked in product management, and prior to that, I did a little bit of business analysis in Panasonic, and my background is actually in electrical engineering. So as you can see, it's industries and it's companies in different industries. Amazon is more logistics, right? Like I was on the logistics side, so I did more supply chain and logistics there. Innova International was very much in fintech, right? And my background, Panasonic was very electronics focused, and my background is electrical engineering, right? So a hodgepodge of experience. But despite that, I felt like I utilized some of my soft skills that I had, in addition to some of the industry knowledge that I gained during my role, that allowed me to go into product management. And I'll talk to you guys a little bit about that. So with that, I'd like to break this presentation into 3 different pieces. I think the first one, I'd just like to talk to you guys about, from what I've seen, what are successful product managers like? Like, if you want to get into product, it's good to emulate what other people who are successful in the industry are doing. So I can talk to you guys a little bit about kind of some of the really smart product managers I work with and what I've learned from them, right? Second one is, what can you guys do to kind of position yourself to go towards a product management career? And lastly, once you do get into product management, just talk a little bit about, like, how do you approach your first 60 days, right? Like, how do you be successful at your role? So with that, I'd like to jump into the first one, which is, what is a successful product manager, right? Before that, I went in and just did a quick definition for what a product manager is, right? I just did a Google, like, what is a product manager? And that's what I got, right? A product manager is responsible for the strategy, roadmap, and feature definition of that product, right? And some of their main responsibilities are setting a product vision and strategy, define what the product team will deliver and the timeline for the implementation, and you provide cross-functional leadership, mostly between engineering teams, sales, marketing, and support. So what does all this kind of boil down to, right? Like, in my head, the way I simplify it is, you can think of a product manager as almost a mini CEO of a product, right? Like, you own that product, and it is your responsibility to make sure that that product is successful. So now, what is involved in a product being successful, right? Like, you have to figure out, okay, 1, am I building the right product? 2, am I building the right features for the right customer set, right? Am I working on the right things at the right time, right? Am I making sure that all of my stakeholders are aware of what am I working on, right? So there's a lot of aspects about your product that you need to think of. What about the marketing aspect of it? What about the operational aspect of it, right? Like, these are all things as a product manager you need to think of when you're thinking about a product, right? And if you abstract that out, and if you think about a big company, that's what a CEO does, right? The CEO looks at the company, and you look at all different aspects of your company and understand how is your company progressing, right? And as a CEO's job, it's your job to make sure you coordinate between all these departments and make sure they're all working towards a common goal to be successful, right? And that's what you do as a product manager, but at a much smaller scale, right? Like, you have smaller teams, you have a smaller area, but it's up to you to make sure that your area is very successful, right? So with that, like, what are some things, right? What are very material things that are actually good to have when you're a good, successful product manager, right? I think the first one is effective communication, right? Like, going back to the fact that a product manager is a mini CEO, how do you keep everyone aligned, right? Like, if you're working with 10 different teams, how do you make sure that every team knows what are you working on, what are they working on, and what are the expectations set from them, right? They turn to you as the product manager to set that, right? So it's up to you to make sure that your communication skills are very clear, and everyone knows that you're talking about, like, what's going on, and you set the right expectations, right? And I always go by the theory that you should always over communicate as a product manager, right? Like, no one's going to be like, hey, stop giving me so many updates on something that I want, right? They want to know. And the more you tell people and the more everyone's aware of what's going on, it makes your life easier as a product manager, because you're like, hey, no one can come to you and say, I had no idea this was going on. Because you're like, look, I told you this happened and you should have known, right? So I think effective communication is key to be a good product manager. I think another one is gaining trust, right? Like, one of the biggest aspects of product management is the fact that you work with many different teams and many different individuals. And what's important for your product success is the fact that these partners that you work with also work in a way that will make your product successful. And sometimes these partners don't have an inherent interest to do some of the work for you, right? Like you need to motivate them. You need to gain their trust to understand like, hey, look, here's this work that you're doing for me is very impactful. And kind of this is how this is how it's going to impact the larger product. This is how it's going to make an impact to your customers. This is how you're adding value, right? Like you want to make your partners feel the ownership that you have in your product, right? And the only way you can get people to take ownership is by gaining their trust and making sure that, hey, we care about this product as well. I think the next one, and I think this is a big one, is actually leadership, right? So as a product manager, you control the work of a lot of engineering teams primarily, as well as some of these other teams, right? But at the end of the day, you're not really their manager, right? They have other managers, they have other mandates, right? You have to lead without actually being their manager, right? So you have to find a way to get them to do your work without saying, hey, I'm your boss, so do your work, right? Like you need to develop those relationships with your partners, and you need to figure out a way as to how can you influence your team without saying, hey, it's coming from the boss, so we have to do it, right? You need to build a self-motivation between your people on your team who are really interested in this and really want to go ahead and help you out in working. And one of the big ones is prioritization, right? As a product manager, one thing, once you guys get into the field, you'll realize is once you own a product, you will have multiple customers and multiple stakeholders, right? And when stakeholders come to you, anything they ask is always the most important thing, right? There will be 10 teams, and to them, it's always like, when do you want this done? Yesterday, right? So you obviously can't do everything at once, right? So you need to be able to effectively prioritize, right? Like you need to know that, hey, we operate with a particular set of resources. And with these set of resources, how can we most effectively use them to deliver the most value, right? So you need to be able to, you need to be able to say no, right? And when I say learn to say no, I say that with a caveat, because I think there's two ways of saying no, right? Like you can always say like, no, I don't care what you're saying, come back to me later. And that's, I don't think the right way to approach that problem. What you want to do is be more constructive, where you say, okay, look, it's not happening today, but let's work through and see if there's a potential workaround we can come up with for your problem in the time being while we approach your bigger problem, right? This way you kind of do two things at once, right? You don't lose your trust with that partner. And at the same time, he understands that, look, there's limited resources. This person is trying to work with me to help me solve my problem. And eventually you come up with a timeline and say, okay, this is when your problem gets solved, right? So you want to say no, but say no the right way, right? And establish frameworks, right? The best way for you to say no to a person is by saying, hey, look, this is why I'm saying no. Like I have this data that says that your feature is going to cause an X amount of revenue improvement versus this other feature that also was asked by someone. And this is the amount of revenue improvement being caused by that. If I had to balance that out, the numbers speak for themselves, right? Like revenue is not always the only option. It could be productivity. It could be the elimination of manual processes. It could be, improving your customer experience, right? Like maybe if your customer is going through multiple steps, you can bring it down to like one step process. That's a big win, right? So always have this framework which says, hey, I'm going to make my decision based on data, right? I'm not just saying no. Here's why I'm saying no. I think the next one is customer obsession. And I think that is key, right? Because at the end of the day, and I've realized this at my current role. So today I work very much in an internal team, which is it is focused for building products for engineering, right? So a lot of my customers are engineers. So by trade, I'm not an engineer, right? So I understand a little bit of technology, right? I understand how programmers work and everything, but if you ask me very in-depth details about programming, I have no idea, right? I bank on my engineering team to do that. And what happens is, especially when you're working on very core engineering products, it's very easy for your engineering team to start suggesting features and things to build, because they're like, hey, look, I'm an engineer. I think this is what's going to be the right thing to get built, right? But as a PM in that room, I have to make sure that I get that validated, right? So despite me being on a very heavy engineering team, I still go out there, try to talk to as many engineers as possible to help understand, like, all right, what are your use cases? What are your needs? and I'll bring that back to the table. And when we are doing planning within my team, I wear the hat of the customer, right? I'm like, hey, look, I don't care what you guys think should be built. This is what our customers want, right? What could happen is your engineers might be thinking super long term, and they might be thinking, hey, this is the right way of approaching this problem. But you go out in reality, all the people out there probably are not thinking the same way, right? So you want to always represent your customer in the room, right? Like your customer is banking on you to be that person in the room and says, hey, look, what my requests are, kind of go to the engineering team and then they work on them, right? Problem solver. I think product management is basically a lot of problem solving, right? Like it is one big problem that you're given and you have to come up with creative ways of solving that problem. Now you could solve that problem many ways, right? You could solve it using technology, you could solve it using people, you could solve it using process, right? So all of these are things that you start need to thinking about. And pretty much like I think product management just boils down to effective problem solving and creative problem solving, right? Like you have to learn to do more with less because you're always in this scenario where you have limited resources and you always have to accomplish a lot more. So you want to try to figure out how can I be more effective and how can I do more with less, right? Curiosity. I think that's one of the biggest things too. Cause I think I fully credit the fact that I'm a PM today is because of curiosity. I never studied product management stuff in school. I never was even exposed to product management until I started my second job. And once I started it, I started learning about things and started learning about the different industries, how different departments in your company work, how do they work with each other, what are the job functions of different teams, like how is a legal team important, how is a compliance team important, how does a marketing team interact with all these, right? As a PM, like the more you know about how different aspects of your organization and how different teams work, the better it is for you to make the case that, hey, look, I understand kind of what's going on in the company and I understand all these products and I understand all these use cases. And now I can actually come and speak about it, right? Like I've done the research, I've figured out what's going on and I can now come back and tell you guys, this is what's up. And the last one, and I added this, and this is very, I'd like to caveat this by saying that this is not necessary, right? Like there's a common misconception that product managers need to be technical. Let me tell you that that is not the case. Doesn't hurt to be technical, right? Because at the end of the day, you're working with engineering, right? So if you understand how engineers speak, it's only going to help you, right? So if you know a little bit about coding or if you want to just understand the basics of software engineering, it will really help you as a product manager. Because if you understand how pull requests work or like, you know, basic principles of how product development work from the engineering side, you can really have that conversation with your engineering team at a much lower level, right? Like you're no longer the guy who just comes in and says, hey, just build that. And then you walk out and you're like, I don't want to deal with the rest. You want to come in and really like understand what they're doing so that you can have more of a honest discussion about what things are going on, right? So, but that being said, if you're not a technical person, that is absolutely not necessary because it's not up to you to be the technical person in the room, right? Your job is purely what does the customer want. If you're technical, helps, but that being said, do not be discouraged if you're not technical because it doesn't matter at all, right? Like the other PM on my team who is, when we are on a very internal engineering heavy team, he's not technical at all. And he's working on heavy engineering products. So it works out. So let's talk about this, right? So I think now we learned a little bit about what effective product managers are. So how can you position yourself to get into this sort of role, right? Like how do you get past this issue of, hey, I'm trying to apply and I don't have 1 year experience. What do I do? Right? I think it starts off by saying, I would say like, figure out who you are as a person, right? Like understand what your strong points are, right? Like there could be many ways. Like as you saw, right? Product management is a very multifaceted role and it requires multiple skill sets, right? Ranging from technical to industry experience to leadership to organization, right? Like as you can see, there's almost 4 tracks. So start thinking about, okay, what are my strong points, right? Is there a particular industry that I have a unique experience in, right? So for example, online lending, right? Like it is a very niche industry and there's certain systems and certain like groups, like certain reports you work with and certain technologies you work with, right? Like the minute you start figuring out, okay, this is the industry I understand, you can have an effective discussion with someone about that industry, right? Or think about what are your technical or your leadership skills, right? I've seen a lot of times engineers transition to product management because they're like, hey, look, we are working on the other side of the fence. And now all of a sudden we want to do product, right? So now what are you bringing to the table? You're like, hey, I used to be an engineer. Now I want to become a product manager. Maybe I don't have the product skill set, but I do have the engineering skill set, right? Like, so I can go talk to engineers about what they're working on. I can dive deep into like super deep into what's going on, right? That's your strong point. Say, for example, you're a marketing person. You're like, I want to go from marketing to product management. What do you bring to the table? I understand how our customers think, right? Like, what does marketing do? Your marketing team is the group that's figuring out what do your customers want, right? And how do you market to them, right? So that's what you bring to the table. For example, you're a project manager, right? You're like, hey, I did project management. I want to get a little bit more deeper in a particular area. You can bring your communication or your project management skill set, right? Because if you see, all of this rolls into product management, right? So there's multiple skill sets you can bring to the table, and other obviously that you learn on the job, right? Like everyone learns on the job. I'm still learning on the job today, right? But you always start off with one strong point and really build on it and then go from there, right? From there, like once you figured out like, okay, maybe here's a particular industry area that I'm good in, or here's like a particular, job skill set that I have, which is going to really be good, start identifying the correct opportunities, right? Like there could be two approaches to this, right? And one is the faster approach, and that's the tougher one, right? Like, hey, I've done this before too, right? Like I've seen PM roles which I've had 1 year experience required, but I've still applied without having any experience because I was like, look, I might not have the PM experience, but I understand how financial technologies work. So I can talk about financial technologies and then I can learn the PM skill set once I join the job. The other one, which is what I took, is more of an indirect approach, right? Like this takes a little bit longer, but because of how tricky it is to get into product management, I really like this approach, right? Like I was an electrical engineer who was a business analyst, and I was like, how the hell do I get into product, right? So what I did was like, hey, you look for non-PM roles in an industry that you potentially understand and position yourself internally to kind of move, right? And I'll talk to you a little bit more about how you can position yourself internally to make this move. But this is also a very effective tactic to get into product management, is you transfer internally from a different role and move into product management. So let's talk about how to move into product management, right? I think it all starts by, so if you're talking to a product team, right? Like what do they want to know? Like if you go to a product team and say, hey, look, I want to be a PM, right? Like the first question is going to be, okay, why? Let's talk about it, right? So the minute the person asks why, you can jump into like, look, I understand the product. This is what our product is. This is what our business offering is. This is the problem that you're trying to solve. This is what our customer base is. This is what they want, right? Do some research, right? Figure out like, okay, what is the problem the product is trying to solve? What's the market? What are the competitors? Who are our customers? Right? Really get a better understanding of the product you're talking about, right? Like, and doing that prior research will tell the person you're talking to that, hey, look, this person's interested in my product, has gone through the research and figured out what's our problem set, what are our customers, what can we do to service these customers, what is the market for this product, and kind of how can we go about doing it, right? Express interest. I think, and this is a little bit more around, sorry, I should have told you before, this is what do you do when you're in an internal role and you want to try to move into product management. So like the indirect approach that I was talking about. So the next one is you want to express interest, right? So you're working in a potential role. Go talk to your product team and be like, hey, look, I work in department X. I'm interested in product management, specifically your team. Kind of what sort of skill sets are you looking for? What are sort of problems that you have in your team today? What are you looking to hire for, right? Like just understand and just express that interest and say, look, I'm interested in product management today. This is what my team is. Let's talk about what needs to happen for me to move to your team, right? Start engaging, having that conversation, and you'd be surprised that a lot of teams want to hire internally, 100%, right? Like I've tried to hire people for our org, and it is so tough to hire externally, right? So if you have someone internally come express interest, and especially if you have that, if you worked with that person before, that person will be more than excited that, hey, look, there's someone internal who's interested to come here. If we can groom that person, my recruiting thing just reduced by half, and it's just so much easier to hire someone internally. So definitely do that. You'll get a very, very positive reaction from the people on your team. Shadow product managers, right? So I think that's one of the biggest things, right? You want to learn what do PMs do, right? Because the thing is, product management isn't a course, right? It is, but it's not like a degree, right? You can't go and say look, I did a bachelor's in product management, so I can come in and I took classes freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior year, right? All PMs have learned what they have on the job, right? So the best way is you start shadowing them, right? Just understand what do they do on a day-to-day basis? What kind of meetings do they go to? What are some of their day-to-day tasks, right? What is top on their priority when they start the day? What are some of the big issues that they run into? What are some of their long-term things that they're working on, right? This not only shows that you've expressed interest, but you've also now shadowing and you're really demonstrating to your team that, look, I'm not just talking about getting into product. I am seriously interested. I want to learn more, right? And this really shows that. Learn about the partner teams that are working with product, right? And I think, again, this goes back to the fact that the PM has to know the entire landscape of that product, right? So do the prior research to understand, okay, within my org, what are the different teams that are contributing to that product, right? How is business operations or product support working on it? How is software engineering contributing to the product? How are teams like marketing contributing to the product? How are teams like legal and compliance contributing to the product, right? Go out there, talk to them, right? And be like, okay, in a product development process, you can talk to some marketing person and be like, what do you do? When do product teams engage you? What are some of the things you're looking for from them? What do you expect? What do they expect from you, right? So if you understand the landscape around your product, it becomes way easier to make the case that, hey, look, I already know the different teams. I know the product, hire me, right? This one is something, is, I think, pretty useful. And I really like this because once you establish this relationship, right? You've spoken to this person, you told them that you're interested, you shadowed them. Maybe start taking that to the next step, right? At the end of the day, what do PMs do, right? They come in, they propose features, they build it, execute it, and then send it to their, and then they send it to their customers, right? So do that, right? Think about it. The first one could be tough, right? You don't know what feature to propose because product teams have priorities, right? It's tough to go and say, hey, build this, right? Your product person might say, look, I don't have the bandwidth. If that's not the case, at least understand, hey, are there any other features or small features that are being worked on which I can help PM, right? Help me understand this little feature. What is the problem it's trying to solve? What is the value of this feature that I'm developing? And let me drive it. Let me take it forward and let me run with it, right? And that way is what you can show is hey, you can show your product person and be like, hey, look, I took this little piece, right? I worked with you. We went through all of the different stages of the product development life cycle. And now we took this little feature from definition to release. And that's precisely what a product manager does. And that way, if you're successful at that, right? And it becomes a very easy case to make. Be like, hey, look, I understood the product. I understood what's around the product. I worked with our engineering team. I actually got a feature out. What's stopping you from hiring me, right? And the reason I said this is has this worked? And the answer is yes. So when I started, right, I was in business operations. And so if you guys don't know, business operations is this team that works with, that supports a product, right? So we were in online lending and we had a website. And what happened was on the website, we used to have loans and loans would get problems, right? And then there was a support team which customers would report to. And then that would be my team, which goes in, fixes these loans on the back end, right? So it's a lot of understanding okay, what is the code base? And you go in and start fixing loans and stuff, right? And as I started doing that, I realized that, hey, look, I'm understanding what our technology is about. And at the same time, I'm understanding what our customers are, right? Because I'm getting tickets from customers and I'm seeing, okay, what sort of loans are they taking out? How many, what sort of people are defaulting versus paying off, and how many people are coming back and taking more and more loans. And I started really understanding the demographic of our customer. And that's what I did. And I actually took part in one of production release, where what happened was I went to our PM and I was like, hey, look, I identified these few things in a code base, because I was in a position to do so, because I was fixing problems in the code. Not in the code, but like I was fixing problems on the website, which eventually obviously are generated by the code base, right? So I said, hey, look, I identified these 5 problems that occur these many times, which requires me, a human, to go in and run all these manual processes to fix. Why are you guys not fixing this upstream? Like why is this coming to a whole another team to get fixed? And he didn't have an answer for me. But he's like, oh yeah, makes sense. So now can we go ahead and get this fixed in the code base? So I was like, with that being said, can I run with it, right? Like I identified the problem. I know what the solution is. Why don't you just let me drive it, right? So he let me drive it. Then after that, I was like, hey, great, look, I've clearly demonstrated that I understand our technology. I understand the product. I understand the customers. Why not hire me as a PM? They were looking to hire a PM. And I was like, I think I'm the best choice you can make. Went, interviewed, and then I got the role. And I think that was my entry into product. And like, when I started my career at Panasonic, I had zero idea that I was getting into product, right? Like I had zero idea what I was doing. I was just doing some stuff, and I happened to stumble upon product management within my career, and I realized that, okay, this is great. And then I kind of somehow, like, in this way, made my way into it. And I think, and it's not, if I could do it, I know for a fact anyone can do it, right? So that's why I really want to share how like this happened, because it's very possible, right? And yeah. Sorry. So with that, right, I'd like to talk to you guys a little bit about what would happen once you do get this product role, right? There are a few things, right? Because it's a new position, you haven't really done it before. Kind of, what are some things you want to really be aware of in the first 60 days so that you can be successful at your job? Because the thing is, once you are a PM, there's a lot of responsibility on your shoulders, right? It's not a small thing, because the thing is, your decision affects not just your product, but all your customers of that product, right? So it's up to you to always make the right call, right? Obviously, everyone makes mistakes. I make mistakes all the time too, but more often than not, you want to make the right call, right? And how do you do that? How do you position yourself to be more successful there? So I would say, starting off, meet more people, right? Like when I started my job in WeWork, my first month, literally all I did was meet people. Right? Like I just went out there, started understanding, okay, I couldn't do the other members on the product team because I was the first person on the product team. So I was like, oh, all right, no one else to talk to, but talk to your engineering teams, right? Understand, like, all right, what is the technology stack you're working on? What are some of the big problems that you're working on? Try to get a better understanding for like, okay, how do those engineering teams work with those product teams? What are their expectations from you, right? Just start building those relationships, right? Partner business teams, right? Like, as I said, your product involves more than just engineering, right? Like, once you're pushing your product out, you'll have to work with teams like marketing, finance, legal, compliance, right? Start going out there proactively and reaching out to them and understanding, like, okay, how do you guys interact with this product team? And let's start creating those relationships, right? Understand your stakeholders. I think that's the most important, right? Like, your product priorities are driven by 2 groups of people, your customers and your stakeholders, right? These could be, and your customers are technically your stakeholders too, but you also have internal stakeholders, right? So for example, on the website that we were building, when we used to release new features, marketing would always have certain things that they'd want added so that they could potentially gather additional data, or, right, I don't know if you guys know about marketing tags, but they have like things on web pages which like track when users are going. Like, they're like, hey, cool, you're adding this new page. Can you please add these features for marketing, right? So there always will be internal stakeholders who have a vested interest in your product, and they have requirements for your product so that they can work, right? So understand what those guys are and how they're using your product. And I think the big one is business operations. I'm a little biased to it because I started in business operations, but I do think it's very valuable to understand from product support as to what's going out there, right? Like, especially for an online company, like say you're a product manager for a website, right? Like, you're not actively meeting your customers. Chances are your customers are calling a call center, which has like, hey, we have problem XYZ. Can you help us fix it? Right? So your business operations team is like almost your front line of defense against these customers. So understand from them, like, what are the problems in the system today? What are the types of things people are reporting? And that way you can get a good understanding for like, hey, look, my customers have these problems, which is causing this amount of extra effort for my product. Maybe I should go fix it, right? So it really gives you a good insight into how your customers are thinking. I think learn about processes. Unfortunately, like, I think process always has a negative connotation to it. I personally don't think so. I think having processes around how you do product management and product development makes your life significantly easier. Like, I worked at organizations where there was no process, and it was a nightmare. So when I joined Amazon, I think my product team was in Seattle. Our engineering team was in India, and our actual product was in the UK. And there was no established process as to how these three teams work with each other. It literally took me 4 months to establish that process. Because before then, we had so many inefficiencies. Everything was getting delayed. No one knew what the hell was going on, who's working on what. So understand those processes, right? It's very important, and it really streamlines how work is getting done. Think about how people do goal planning, right? Like, as a PM, that's one of your jobs, is like figuring out, okay, what are the goals for my product? So think about in your org, how do people think about goal planning? What are the inputs that go into it? Who do they talk to, right? Like, get an understanding for that. Think about success metrics reporting, right? Like, so one of the biggest things about product is the fact that once you launch a feature or a product, kind of how do you say if your launch is successful or not, right? Like, when you're thinking about your product and you're planning it, one of the most critical things is understanding, hey, once I release my product, what do I need to think? What are active numbers that I need to see that will tell me if my product launch was successful or not? Like, you need to know this beforehand, right? Because if you're thinking about your product, you're like, let's say, going back to the lending example, right? Like, I launched a new type of loan. Simple success metric is how many new loans were taken in a particular region, right? Always think about success metrics and how do you want to show them out to people, right? Like, because the thing is, when you talk to your leadership, they're going to ask you like, hey, cool, you built whatever feature. Can you tell me if it was worth it? And you're like, hey, look, this is the data. These are the metrics that we had identified, and these are how the numbers are trending, right? So always have that plan ready and learn about how people are doing those today. And communication cadence, right? As I've spoken early on, I think a big part about product management is communication, right? So learn like, okay, how do you send out weekly updates? How do you update leadership? How do you say, for example, like if you send out sprint updates, what is the format of sending sprint updates, right? Like, what are the regularly recurring meetings with whom? What are the topics discussed in there, right? Like, really understand how do you want to proliferate the information that you're soon going to have with the rest of the group that you're going to be working with on a day-to-day basis, right? So, and this is already going to be happening today, right? So just learn. Again, learn about the product. I can't stress this enough, right? Like, you first did the research initially, right? Where you're like, okay, it's some high-level overview, kind of have a good idea for what our product is. But now you're actually part of the team. So now you need to know the ins and outs of the product, right? Like, people are going to look to you as a subject matter expert on your product. Start thinking about those, right? Read product documentation, right? Like, go through wikis, go through any like design docs that are around and just learn like, okay, what is the product? Get your engineering teams to do demos for you, right? Like, if there's features and things that are being worked on, go into your engineering team and say, hey, look, can you show me how, again, going back to my lending example, when I joined, I was like, hey, look, can you take me through the journey of a customer when he comes into the website all the way through to him getting an issued loan? Right? It's simple. Just the guy will take you through like their staging clusters, and they'll just take you through the customer process. That way you really understand how your customers are actually interacting with the product, right? And you understand kind of like the nuances of the different things that could happen. Understand what's on the roadmap and what are the features that are being developed, right? Like, what is being worked on? Why is it being worked on? When will it be ready? What are some of the success metrics there, right? And also think about the long-term plans for this product, right? Like at the end of the day, you are building this product to solve problems, right? Like think about what is the long-term strategy. Like what I've learned is as you start developing a product, you will have a potential vision on day one. And you think that this vision is good for the next 5 years. But a year into product development, you realize that, hey, look, maybe my vision was too narrow, right? Maybe what I thought the product could be used for was too narrow, and I can actually make it wider and use it for these 20 other things, right? But you wouldn't know that on day one. It comes from learning, right? So always keep understanding what are the long-term plans, what are you building towards, and more importantly, what's the problem you're trying to solve, right? Go back to what's the problem you're trying to solve in the long term and how are we approaching it. Learn about your customer, right? So now you learned about your product. The next most important piece is actually learning about your customer, right? Like figure out if there's any support or sales calls, sit on them, right? Just understand how do your support or your sales teams work with your customers. What kind of questions do customers ask? What's top of their mind when they're talking to your sales team or your customer support team about your product, right? It really gives you that first-hand insight into how your customer's thinking. Because no matter what you read and like docs people write and like go from hearsay, it is nowhere comparable to actually talking to your customer one-to-one, right? Because you just get the most direct feedback, which is what you want, right? Conduct customer interviews. Go out there and say, look, I'd like to talk to a couple of our end customers. Just set it up. I'm sure there are mechanisms for you, depending on what company you work for, where they can actually set it up for you. And then you can, and before you do customer interviews, right, just think about what do you want to understand from the customer, right? Like do a little bit of prep work to figure out like, okay, what are the questions I want to ask? What are some things I'd want to tease out from this interaction with this customer that will help me make decisions in the future, right? Talk to your team and understand, have any surveys been taken? Are there any other insights that have already been generated based on customer feedback, right? If there are, learn about them, because this is feedback that's coming to you directly from your customer base, and it's super important, right? So if this content is out there, definitely go in there and figure it out. And I think another one is continual improvement. And I think this goes back to being curious, right? I think as with every industry, we are all innovating all the time, right? And I think if you want to stay on top of things, I think what's important is that you are continually improving yourself, right? Like you're trying to go out, attend some conferences about product management or attend some conferences in the subject area that you work in, right? You can attend meetups. There's a ton of meetups around which talk about like many different things, right? Everything ranging from very, very product focused meetups to very, very specific things like, okay, prioritization meetups. I think I saw one. Things around like, okay, I want to understand engineering, right? Like if you want to understand, hey, I work for WeWork, so I'm in the co-working space, right? If I want to understand a little bit more of the business of co-working, there's co-working startups, right? So, co-working meetups, right? I can go attend all these, right? So really think about how you can enhance your knowledge base to make your job easier, right? And take classes, right? So things like the product school, things like Coursera, things like courses online, right? Like there's a dearth of content out there which you guys can use to really better yourself and really understand like, okay, what am I lacking in? And like, how can I get better with that, right? Like, so for example, I'll tell you, like when I joined my current role, I'm a product manager for data platform, which is more data infrastructure. But I came in not knowing anything about data platform. Like I had zero idea. Like I remember my first month at work, every meeting I was just Googling stuff, right? Because people were just talking about stuff I had no idea about. So I was like, I'm not going to pretend to say that I have a clue. So I'm just going to sit and Google stuff. And then I went in and there's a lot of blogs and a lot of stuff around like data infrastructure. I did some reading and now I find myself so comfortable talking about all of these technologies. And this has just been like a year and a half. And I'll be very honest, I'm not the smartest guy. So if I could figure that out, I'm sure anyone can, right? So it's definitely, but you need to take an interest in it, right? Like just take an interest in continually improving yourself and it will work out. Now with that, right, I think we are approaching towards the end. I'd like to leave you guys with just one big thing, right? Like if you forget everything else I spoke about today, and if you went away with one takeaway, I like it to be like, always ask this question: what problem am I trying to solve? Right? That is the crux of product management. Everything that you do is the answer to this question, right? Like the minute you know what problem you're trying to solve, everything falls back into place. You understand, how do I prioritize? You understand, what should I build? You understand, who do I talk to? You understand, what should I not build, right? Like this is, anytime you find yourself doubting yourself, like, okay, am I doing the right thing? Always step back and think out what's the problem you're trying to solve. And I'm sure when you, in your head, if you keep trying to answer that question, it will tell you if you're going down the right path or not.